All right, folks, this is the last set of videos for your ecology unit. This is going to be like technically the fifth PowerPoint, quite a few more videos. This is ecosystem ecology. We're focusing on two things, basically ecosystem dynamics and biomes. So when we look at ecosystem, which is the largest picture, and if you've noticed, for the most part, we can study it most specifically, which would be animal behavior, to population ecology, community ecology, and then what we consider ecosystem ecology. We see that there are the two cycles of matter and energy, and this dates back to your very first PowerPoint when we looked at this first and second law of thermodynamics, the idea that within a closed system, which is your matter in your ecosystem, that matter is always conserved through the process of photosynthesis, digestion, growth, excretion, respiration, decomposition. That matter is always, those chemical compounds are always going to be there. Their form is just going to change based on where they're existing within the ecosystem at the time. The second law of thermodynamics talks about the idea of entropy or disorder within a system. And essentially what happens is our open system within the ecosystem or within the globe is allowing energy to come in as light energy and to exit as thermal energy. And so once that thermal energy goes through our atmosphere, it's gone forever. This is why technically we are always struggling to find sources of energy, right? When we're using fossil fuels, why we are trying to commit to using solar panels and things like that is because technically energy is not a renewable resource. Once we use that energy, we utilize it, it is then waste energy, which is heat. Heat is not really usable for any type of process. There are multiple ways that we harness that first energy. And there's two types of inputs of energy into our open system. Solar energy is from the sun. It's processed using photosynthesis. Photosynthesis turns it into chemical energy, which is the sugars and the starches, the things that we eat and we use. Hydrothermal energy and chemosynthesis is going to be the use of basically a chemical energy into a more usable form of chemical energy, essentially. This occurs mostly in hydrothermic vents. Those are, if you think about under the sea, hydrothermal vents are the like hot water vents under the sea, and there are bacteria that use hydrothermal energy, which is like warm water energy, right? Hydrothermo. And so that is probably the only case where we see that the heat, the water that contains the heat, is used for an energy source. Almost all organisms get their energy from solar energy, or the origin was, right? When we get our energy, it's usually not from solar energy unless you're totally vegan or vegetarian. There's lots and lots of diagrams that allow you to visualize matter and energy. When you are looking at these diagrams, make sure that when we look at all these diagrams, you can separate all of these arrows and the stuff into matter or energy. Matter, and this is good to keep in the back of your mind, is always going to be your chemical compounds: carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, all of that stuff, oxygen. Your energy is going to be always and only heat or energy forms. So thermal energy, which is heat, solar energy, light, chemical energy, which is the energy within the chemical bonds. And that's where these two things come together, is that we store energy in chemical bonds. The chemicals themselves are reused, and when they rebond, they harness that energy. But the energy in the bonds, if you remember, when we break and make bonds, this is from chemistry, right? There's this exchange of energy. And so that's where my matter and energy link up within all of these cycles and within your ecosystem. The best way to think about the cycle of energy and your different compounds is to start with like the very beginning, right? Primary production. And when we talk about ecosystem, there are all these different organisms and plants that have certain roles. And one of the organisms are going to be your primary producers. If you think about what we know about very basic ecology, right, we've got our producers and our consumers. Your producers are making the energy, and producers are pretty much always plants. When we talk about these plants making energy, and we're looking at a specific ecosystem, we talk about gross primary productivity, which is the total amount of energy that producers convert from sunlight into chemical energy per unit of time. Obviously, the more plants and the more effective they are, and the more input of sunlight, the more gross primary productivity is made. We call it gross because it is the sum of all of those plants. The plants have to use some of that energy themselves, right? For growing, for maybe making fruit. And so the leftover energy that's usable for us or for other organisms is net primary productivity. So that's actually the more important variable, because net primary productivity is the usable energy for the next organisms. Stuff that's already been used by the plant for things is not usable anymore. If you want to, take a minute to pause and look at this graph. Try to interpret it on your own. If you want me to go over it, please bring it up during class. But this is looking at net primary productivity based on biome. Take a look at this, see if you can garner any information from this. When we talk about ecosystems, so we've started at the bottom, right, with our primary producers, technically the very base of a food pyramid. And the thing to think about is pyramid is very linear, is that we start with our joules of sunlight. We measure energy using joules, and then we have our primary producers, our plants. They are producing most of the energy, and it's called our net energy. The next step are going to be our primary consumers. These are going to be pretty much all herbivores. They eat only plants, and they directly feed upon that source. This is why a lot of people recommend a vegetarian diet, because technically you're getting your energy directly from that source, and there's none lost in the consumption of that energy from like the cow that you ate. Secondary consumers are going to eat them, and tertiary consumers are going to be, and secondary consumers might be omnivores, eating plants and animals. Tertiary consumers, mostly carnivores, they actually get the least amount of energy from whatever they consume, because at every step, energy is being lost as heat, and the energy that that organism is physically using. That means that tertiary consumers, like ourselves, need to eat a lot, and they need to eat very high energy-rich diets. And so that is why they prey upon very large organisms usually. The pyramid, there's two ways that we organize all the different organisms in an ecosystem. The trophic level, or the pyramid, is stacked and linear, basically saying this is at the very bottom, produces the most energy. We go primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary if we get to that. It's linear. The other type is food web. That's much more common because we know that there are multiple dynamics, right? These human meat eaters are not the only organisms that eat the cattle, right? These biomass periods essentially show us the amount of energy in that space. So, right, green shows that primary producers have a huge amount of energy, and they produce a ton, that net primary productivity, right? So even when they're using a little bit for themselves, they're still producing a ton. That gets cut down very quickly when we go to primary consumers, because our herbivores, although they are feeding directly on those plants, they are mobile creatures usually, and they use a lot more energy than the plants are using. So we see with each step, the amount of energy that's passed on is cut into a fraction of what it originally was. This is kind of talking about the balance between the number of individual organisms versus the amount of energy. And so is this a terrible thing that just because I'm at the very top means I don't get access to as much energy? Not really when we look at the numbers, right? There's a ton of plants in this field, right? At the bottom it's talking about a field. And there's quite a few less consumers. That means that there needs to be less energy to go around. The problem we stumble across is when we see overpopulation. Too many organisms for the amount of energy that's necessary. So we, as humans, are far too large of a species because we require a ton of energy. What we're consuming doesn't provide us with that. And instead of us being like the smallest number, right, we should be, if we're going to be tertiary consumers, there should only be some of us so that we're not feeding on an excess of everything else. So we're going to go from like the most simple to kind of a more complex version of the cycles. This is just energy. So keep in mind, second law of thermodynamics, not talking about the chemical cycles or the geochemical cycles. We see that at sun is placing energy into primary producers. We see that the dotted pink lines are going to be your energy lines. We see that at each step of the way on the left, heat is lost, right? I'm giving off heat right now. Every organism is, and that energy is lost forever. So that's where the first amount of energy is lost. As these organisms maybe decay or also produce waste as they defecate and things like that, we see on the far right what we call detritus. That is also energy wasted. Then we see that there is some usable energy that goes from primary producers to consumers to herbivores in the form of the dotted pink arrows just moving up. And so we see that there is basically a small amount of energy directly transferred and a whole lot lost on both sides. The blue arrows indicate the transfer of the geochemical, so carbon, all that stuff, and we will talk about that later. What's important here is that the reason that we cut down so quickly on the amount of energy that's transferred is because it's being lost in a variety of ways, and we are not a very efficient system. Right, again, this is just an example of where that energy goes. Some of it goes into cellular respiration, right? So when I eat, I do cellular respiration. Some of it goes into growth. We are all growing. Even if I'm an adult and I haven't grown in height, my bones are still shaping, my muscles are still changing, I still go through growth, and then my waste products, heat and defecating and things like that, also going to be energy that is lost. So for something to eat me, I am not a great source of energy because I'm using energy to do all three of these things already. So let's move past the energy, talking about energy, and let's pause here, just worry about like energy, and the next video is just going to focus on the biogeochemical cycles. Hopefully this will kind of put it into compartments for us.